Hi, everyone. All right, we are ready and live. Hello, I'm Serena Mohan. I'm the Director of Public Programming and Events for the Preservation Resource Center. Thank you all for being here. We are so excited about today's workshop. Before we get started, I just want to go through a little bit of bookkeeping. So first of all, I just want to say thank you to Stephen Richard Parnes, who is the incredible sponsor of not only today's talk, but the online series of classes that the PRC has been able to put on while we're all at home. Thank you to Stephen for making all of this possible and for making it possible for us to keep this content coming and free and open to everyone. It has been such a great ray of sunshine for us to be able to do this programming and talk to so many people about a really wide variety of different historic preservation topics. So thank you to Stephen. Also, thank you to our PRC members. It is also not possible for us to do this work without the support of our incredible members. I see a number of you in the audience here today, so thank you for making this possible. If you're not yet a member of the PRC, please consider joining. Members really sustain us throughout the year, not only for keeping this type of programming available and free. Members also make our magazine, Preservation in Print, possible, and with your membership you also get a subscription to the magazine, so you can have that wonderful magazine delivered to your door 9 times a year. Our members make all of our work possible, so our advocacy work, helping to make sure that the policies that are in place help preservation happen and help make it available for everyone. The work that we're doing now in the Tremaine neighborhood, providing critical repairs for low-income to moderate income homeowners to help with their historic district violations. This is all possible because of our supporters, our sponsors, our members, so thank you. If you are already a member and you want to continue to support us, please check out our website. We have incredible merchandise. We just released a new line of t-shirts. So that is a wonderful way to support us and literally wear your love of historic preservation on your chest. We have a wonderful coffee table book that was put out late last year. All of this is available on our website, prcno.org. So please consider supporting us in any way you would like to. And you just being here today is support. We want to talk to you guys about preservation. We're here to be a resource. So thank you for being here and being part of this dialogue. Some logistical issues. For those of you that are viewing this particular class in the Zoom platform, you're correct that you don't have, your camera's not on and your mic is not on. So you're muted. We can't see you, we can't hear you, but we do want to hear from you if you have questions. So you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen in order to ask questions of us. And we will sort of look at those, and as we go through the class, we'll be able to ask those. We're going to save the Q&A largely for the end of the class. So put your questions in there as you think of them, and then we'll get to as many as we can, obviously, at the end of the class. If you're having any technical difficulties, feel free to chat me in the chat function. Just let me know. Maybe I can help walk you through it. If you're watching on Facebook, thank you for joining us. You can't necessarily ask us questions, so if you want to ask questions for next time, do join and register through Zoom. But thank you for watching and being a part of this. And without further ado, I want to pass the mic over to my colleague, Nathan Lott, who supervises and manages all of the policy and research work and advocacy work that the Preservation Resource Center does. But he is also our resident expert on climate resilience and the impact of our historic built environment on climate change and our efforts to become a more resilient community. So Nathan, thank you for coordinating this incredible talk today, and take it away.
All right. Thanks so much, Serena. I really appreciate that. We're going to hear from two very bright women today from whom I've learned a lot. I had the pleasure of working with them in the last chapter of my career, doing stormwater management capacity building and professional development. I'm just going to begin with a few quick slides. I hope these will work to help us kind of put into context the conversation we're having today. All right. Okay, so first is the title, Climate Resilience for Existing and Historic Communities. You know, what that looks like in Southeast Louisiana, as we're going to learn today, is really different in different parts of our state. But we know that all parts of our state are extremely vulnerable to the effects of climate change, um, rising seas, stronger storms from a warmer Gulf, and many other factors. And that's particularly important to our existing and historic communities. It's something we've been exploring at PRC for several years. These are a few recent articles from our magazine, Preservation in Print, and I'll have links to these at the very end, along with some other resources for y'all. But the one that inspired today's is really the article there, Climate Change and Historic Preservation, a frank conversation with New Orleans experts, that our executive director, Danielle, did as a Q&A with Stephen and Martin, and highly recommend that to you. I think Liz will talk at least briefly about some of the work she's done with Stephen through the LA Safe program. I always like to drop in a few numbers to put things in context, and lean on the data. 25% is probably an undercounting, but it's a credible counting of the coastal land that we've lost in Southeast Louisiana over the past century to a combination of factors: subsidence, erosion, and sea level rise, being three main ones. So what does that look like, and how does that relate to the places that we know and love, especially those of us that are in New Orleans? This is a map from 1922. This is the sort of historic conditions before the 29 flood and the leveeing off of 27 flood and the leveeing off of most of the Mississippi by the Corps of Engineers. And then this is 2014 aerial view that highlights both the lost coastal fringe. But I wanted to show this because it also really shows the juxtaposition between the verdant green areas that are mostly in agriculture and the very dark gray areas that are urbanized. And we see New Orleans there as that gray dot at the top of the screen. And that's important for those of us that live inside the levee system. And Dana's going to help us understand what resilience looks like there and how we deal with that all too gray condition, how we change that. So now let me introduce our two speakers. Liz is the Climate Justice Program Director at Foundation for Louisiana, and in that capacity, she oversees their Coastal Resilience Leverage Fund, which has provided funding and technical support for Lead the Coast, which is a leadership development program for Louisianans, and LA Safe, which is in partnership with the Office of Community Development, which has been a coastwide resilience planning initiative, and sort of led into a watershed planning initiative statewide. And before that, she was the research fellow at Louisiana State University Coastal Sustainability Studio. And prior to that, she was an instructor at LSU, but also at 3 universities in the UK. So she's bringing international expertise back home today. And she'll be followed by Dana Brown, who is principal and founder at Dana Brown Associates, a landscape architecture and planning firm locally that does work not just in New Orleans, but throughout Louisiana and nationally. She's a fellow in the American Society of Landscape Architects, certified planner, and a LEED accredited professional. She did her bachelor's in landscape architecture at LSU and then went on to do a master's at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. So LSU invited her back as an adjunct professor at the Robert Wright School of Landscape Architecture, which is one of the best in the country, if you didn't know. She serves in a volunteer capacity at the Water Environment Federation Stormwater Committee and helps plan their annual conference, WEFTech, which hopefully will be coming to New Orleans this October. And we'll see a resumption in the economic boost that we get out of that biannual conference coming to New Orleans. But we'll see. She's a certified trainer in the National Green Infrastructure Certification Program. So she's training people to do green infrastructure installations, do them correctly, which is so important. And she does a lot of volunteer work as well with Waterwise Gulf South and Louisiana Urban Stormwater Coalition. I hope she'll share some of that with us when she gives her remarks. So with that, I'm going to unshare my screen and turn it back over to Liz.
Thanks so much, Nathan.
There we go. Perfect.
Let me make sure I'm on the right one. great. Okay. Well, are y'all seeing that in presenter view? I don't know why it's doing that.
Yes,
Yeah, you are.
we are, and we actually had this the last one of these.
The last one. Okay.
I have to recall what the solution was. Yeah.
I might PDF it real quick. I know that's not ideal, but I think it'll give us flexibility.
Thinking on the fly.
Okay, wonderful. I'm gonna come back. Okay, is that the full screen?
It is.
Great, wonderful. Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks so much to y'all for inviting me. Thank you. It's great to see old colleagues that I feel like I used to work with in another life, and great to be a part of this conversation. So as Nathan said, I'm Liz Williams-Russell. I'm the Climate Justice Program Director for Foundation for Louisiana. FFL is a statewide community foundation and philanthropic intermediary that pulls in resources and works to get them on the ground to support equitable outcomes in our communities across Louisiana. We were actually founded in the days following Hurricane Katrina and meant to be a resource that could pull in resources from all over and ensure they got into the hands of Louisianans and really impacted the work here. So it's with gratitude that I'm able to be here today. As Nathan mentioned, my background, I was in architecture school when Hurricane Katrina hit. My family is all across South Louisiana, and this work is really critical and powerful and personal. And so I feel very privileged to get to continue to do this work and lead it from the place that I do. I want to start by zooming out all the way to a national scale and looking at the basin of the Mississippi River. The Mississippi drains everything from the Rocky Mountains to the Appalachians. And so to be able to understand that all of that water has actually come down through Louisiana and for centuries been building our state is really powerful. We are the sort of funnel of all of the dirt and mud and water that comes from 41% of the US. And that has forever tied our relationship to water and to future climate impacts and current climate impacts to the ground. The historic Mississippi River system was always looking for the shortest, fastest route to the Gulf of Mexico, right? Indigenous peoples lived amongst these lands and got used to the dynamic nature of that landscape. But you see in these diagrams across the screen that the river was always growing and changing, losing land in some places while it gained land in others. And the way that we continue to develop and evolve is deeply tied to that. So most of where our development occurred across South Louisiana is along those sort of historic high ground that's formed by the river. So in those areas where
Forgive me for interrupting you, but some commenters are saying the slides are not changing. We're just still seeing this title slide. I'm not sure.
Are y'all seeing them change?
I still see the title slide as well.
Okay, I don't know why it's doing that. I will try to go back. So is this allowing you when y'all see it here? Are you seeing the river?
I am now. Now I am seeing, yeah, the watersheds
Okay.
of the U.S.
And are you seeing a different slide now or the same slide?
Now I'm seeing the historic Mississippi Delta was always a dynamic landscape.
Okay, wonderful. So I think we got it. Y'all let me know if that comes back up. But so this was the slide I showed when talking about the Mississippi River and the history, the sort of breadth, all of that water and mud comes down and has built the land that is now southern Louisiana. So we drain everything from the Rockies to the Appalachians. So can you see the slide with a Delta history now?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so in this slide, you can see that the river was always changing. So 5,000 years ago, it was different than 2,000 years ago and 1,000 years ago, and then 500 from now. And across this history of the Delta, you see that there were areas of new land and land that was sustained and land that was declining and eroding and subsiding. That was the natural process of the Delta. And indigenous peoples and various indigenous tribes had no problem living among the Delta landscape. There's sort of reverence for the river and an understanding of the dynamic system. As European colonization came in, we see development start to occur along the spines of where the river used to be. And actually the Arpents, there was a way of purchasing land that included from the bayous all the way out to the back bay that allowed you certain tools and certain opportunities economically, certain materials, but we really built consistent with the landscape at the time. You see this in New Orleans as well. I know many of you are from New Orleans, as are viewing from New Orleans. A lot of, we used to develop mostly along the high ground ridges. And then as New Orleans grew, we expanded out and out and out into the more swampy areas. We were developing engineering technologies to be able to drain those conditions. But really the development was expanding from the high ground out into the system. I also want to be very clear that inequities have become embedded in the built environment through those processes. So what you're looking at here is a map of where redlining was occurring in New Orleans. So communities that are drawn in red here were seen as less valuable. It was racialized valuation practices, and the bluer communities were seen as more prime lending areas. And so those sorts of decisions, the way we value things, the way we have purchased and acquired lending capital have influenced then where we've invested in roads, where we've invested in drainage, how we've invested in infrastructure, where we've provided different social services. We could go on and on with this conversation, but I want to be very clear that these inequities that we're seeing play out even with COVID are deeply embedded in how we build as well and how we resource our communities. But over the last few hundred years, the human and natural changes have caused a century of delta change. So the top left map you see shows all of the distributaries of the river system. And in the spring, the flooding would overflow the natural banks of the river, but that was harmful to communities that existed there, obviously, and to the prospects of economic growth. So following the flood of 1927, we levied off that system. We then also allowed for pervasive investment in oil and gas infrastructure and maritime infrastructure that crisscrossed canals through those wetland areas and exacerbated saltwater intrusion that may have been a natural process in places and wasn't in others. And so you see, just as Nathan mentioned prior, a loss of land from 1960 to today and into the future that is vast and impacts all of our communities. So following Hurricanes Katrina and Rita in 2005, the new organization of the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority was stood up to be able to put forward a comprehensive plan that included restoration and structural protection like levees, as well as buyouts and elevations. And they also have some of the most sophisticated modeling that exists globally around where we're seeing impacts currently and into the future around land loss and increased flood risk. So these maps show you different scenarios of sea level rise with and without ongoing investment to reduce our flood risk and ongoing investment to restore our coast. But there is a reality that I want to come to that we still expect a great deal of land loss even with full implementation of the Coastal Master Plan. The reality also, Hurricanes Katrina, Rita, Gustav, Ike, Isaac, we know these disasters in Louisiana just from the last 15 years, and we know them throughout our history. And at a federal level, we continue to see policy responses reacting to disasters in terms of climate change, right? In terms of extreme weather events. And so we're always on this flip back and forth between the event itself and policy to try to react to it. But I want to be clear here, if this is a zoom into the current condition, this is 50 years from now or less than 50 years from now, but with full implementation of the Coastal Master Plan. So you're still seeing a significantly smaller land footprint, meaning that flood risk coming from storm surge and erosion with sea level rise will continue to mean that waters are reaching further into our communities. And that also impacts where we see flood risks. So the darker blues here are deeper waters, and this is our current condition from a 1 in 100 year storm, which actually has a 26% of chance of occurring over the life cycle of a 30-year mortgage. But we see a lot of those darker blues and deeper waters getting in closer to our communities 50 years from now, even with full implementation of the Coastal Master Plan. So in reaction to this, folks are moving, right? I mentioned all the storm events. We're seeing trends where people with resources often are able to pick up their families and go to what are perceived as higher or safer grounds. Whether those are social resources and networks or financial resources, they then are impacting where we have tax bases and ability to continue to invest in infrastructure. So in a lot of these areas with giant red dots, you're seeing huge population losses over the last 15 years. And also that affects education and where we can provide schooling or where we have loss of healthcare, what tax revenue is available in that area to either maintain your existing infrastructure or invest in new infrastructure to reduce your risk. Also, of course, you're seeing other impacts in areas that are growing in populations. So you're seeing schools over capacity or traffic swell, but you're also seeing permitting of new development, often without any regard for where water has gone or will go, just to accommodate that swell in population, and because the parishes want to see a growth in their tax base. So we could talk about this in, again, a whole deeper conversation, but these shifts in revenue cause tipping points in the way we can govern and the way we can finance to maintain and continue to support our communities that are much more vast than purely environmental. So many folks tend to think of climate change as an environmental issue, and it really stretches into everything that we care about. I also want to just underscore that this ongoing migration, these are some future migration projections done with the data center. Excellent work really illustrating that, yes, of course, people are moving to the cities we already know, like Lafayette or Baton Rouge or the North Shore, but we also see people moving to Shreveport or Monroe or Alexandria or Houston or Gulfport or Atlanta. And this is not a question of one state versus another or one region versus another. These implications are really far reaching. I want to zoom in. Nathan mentioned I would talk about the LA SAFE process. In 2016, the state of Louisiana had won $92.6 million from the National Disaster Resilience Competition for these 6 parishes, which are a real microcosm of flood risk. If you just look at the diagram on the top right, you see that these 6 parishes have actually included 8.5% of the historic national flood insurance payouts ever. And so really zooming into these parishes was really critical. So the LA SAFE process, we at the foundation were working with residents in Plaquemines Parish to essentially address concerns that we were hearing of, by the time I see a plan, all the decisions have already been made and it doesn't account for changing jobs or changing social fabric. So what does it actually look like to center community needs to make sure we're doing so with the really sophisticated future environmental conditions that we know, and that we're incorporating best planning practices and expertise. So over the course of 2017, we were able to co-fund and co-manage these huge planning meetings across these 6 parishes with the state, and be able to ensure that resident leaders were facilitating the meetings, that we were centering conversations around land loss and population movement around what are the impacts to your community and culture, your economy and jobs, your environment and sustainability into the future. We were also really able to make sure that the community input was leading to the development of new ways of thinking about projects and programs and what policy recommendations should be for sectors that really don't consider themselves to be coastal or environmental or be really impacted by a changing climate. We wanted to make sure that barriers that traditionally keep a lot of folks out of meetings were removed. Simple things like providing childcare and food and transportation, but also making sure that your neighbor, your friend, or your family member was the person facilitating the table conversation with you, that this wasn't somebody from down the road or up the river or New Orleans or Baton Rouge actually leading these conversations. And we were able to plan across a number of different risk levels when it came to flood risk and land loss, but also across planning categories. And we were able to confront some of the really challenging conversations that are presented in the Coastal Master Plan through talking about them in terms of time. So 10 years from now, you might be thinking about yourself in one of these meetings, maybe your kids, but 25 years from now, you might be thinking about your kids or your grandkids. 50 years from now, most of us in a room are not thinking about ourselves and what we need. We're thinking about the generations that come after us. So how does that enable us to think differently about what preservation looks like, or what future design should look like, or how our communities should behave, and how our communities are resourced? It enables us to back into some of the most difficult conversations about climate change, which is a reality that, as visualized in the Coastal Master Plan, we don't expect all of our communities to still be here 50 years from now. The data that the state shows us and that has been unanimously passed through our state legislature illustrates that there are some communities that are expected to succumb to the impacts of land loss, even with $50 billion of investment. So in this planning process, we were able to move towards essentially crowdsourced land use planning. So how do we look at these risk levels across time horizons and think about what we should be designing for our future, and what types of needs are going to be in our communities at these different points in time. And I really want to highlight this, especially in a moment now where we know our state's budget and our local budgets are in crisis, that we don't have enough money to just pay for each of these challenges individually. We have to be thinking about housing in the context of flood risk, and you have to be thinking about education and economic opportunity in the context of what projects we're investing in. So how do we invest in all of these things in a cohesive way is some of the ongoing work that we're pursuing now. I also want to highlight the amazing reality that the state went ahead and invested $41 million in projects that were voted on by the public. So at the end of 2017, all of the meeting participants, the constituents who were part of the meeting planning process, came and received tokens and got to put the tokens in these anonymous tubes that showed which ones they wanted to see receive investment. And the state did go forward and actually invest in the top projects. So the project portfolio you see is not only inclusive of projects that would be considered environmental. There are some green infrastructure projects, but there are also buyouts. There's an economic and a diversification and emerging industry business incubator. There's resilient affordable housing. There's mental health and substance abuse support in a parish that was really lifted over and over again. And then these strategies have been incorporated into the LA Safe adaptation strategies, which are available online, lasafe.la.gov. You can look at each one of these documents. They're 200-page documents each, and there's one for each of the 6 parishes that was a part of this process, as well as a regional document that's really applicable across the state and relevant to lots of other places around the country and the world. One of the key things that came from this process, and one of the areas that FFL continues to deepen investments in, is how do we think about affordability and development and housing in our future communities, and our current communities in a way that's consistent with these expectations. So in areas that we expect to continue to be high and dry, how do we support density and development with multi-use corridors? How do we see how do we respond in areas that we expect to continue to see sea level rise? And how do we reduce vulnerability so that we're not exacerbating the existing risks that we face? In areas already receiving influxes of population, how can we incentivize development in a way that's smart, as opposed to just allowing continued sprawl and expansive development without any regard for the water? So consolidating existing assets, as well as thinking about inclusive growth. We're seeing some of our local parishes start adapting those adaptation strategies. St. John has done so as an ordinance. This is hugely relevant when it comes to the floods of 2016. Many of you remember that we had huge amounts of rainfall in a 48-hour period. We had more than 26 inches of rain in that short period of time. And when you combine those trends, right, the trend that with climate change, we're seeing more rainfall in shorter amounts of time, that's overlapping with development expanding without any regard for where the water goes, meaning that that total environmental change is inducing increased risk across our communities. And so 54 of our parishes in the state of 64 parishes were under a federal flood declaration from that disaster, and the Louisiana Watershed Initiative, a 5-state agency effort, is moving forward to actually invest in watershed planning. So a lot of the work that we're supporting around affordability and housing and what does development look like, but also stormwater management needs to be incorporated into here. I want to lift another one of our partners, the Center for Planning Excellence, that really tried to build on a lot of the lessons learned from LA Safe. They were a key partner in that process, and really design out urban, suburban, rural areas. How do these different strategies look different? And they designed this fantastic game that folks can actually play to trade. I'm gonna handle this amount of water with this amount of tokens. So I'm really understanding the requirements needed for policy shifts. One of the last things I'll mention is that, you know, at the state of Louisiana, we have more than $500 million a year going to coastal restoration from the BP Deepwater Horizon settlement. We know from all of the data that I just showed, we know that people with resources are more able to adapt. We're more able to adapt if we have a paying job that allows us to finance and get access to different services. So how do we make sure that all of these jobs being created by coastal restoration and water management are actually going to people in Louisiana? How do we make sure folks in Louisiana are getting access to these jobs, these business opportunities, so that we're actually increasing our economic resilience and diversifying our economy, so that we're more able to transition and deal with the adaptation necessary? So all of the work that we're doing, just to sum up, is towards healthy, vibrant, and a more equitable Louisiana. And that Louisiana is going to look a lot different than how it does today, and a lot of the same, because we all want to support the things we know and love, and there's a reason why we all want to continue living here. And we live in a place that has the flexibility to be able to live with water. That's our history. It is our present to some degree, but how do we actually continue to make investments that allow us to comprehensively design and respond to our challenges and create a more vibrant Louisiana? With that, I'll just say thanks for your attention. I hope I didn't take too long. I forgot to start timing and everything. So feel free to lift up any questions whenever we get there.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I'll remind everybody that you can use the chat function to chat your questions. And then after Dana speaks, I will be glad to put them to our panelists. Somebody's saying thank you. That was excellent. So yeah, it was a great comprehensive overview. And one of the things you mentioned coming out of the LA Safe projects was a project in Gretna. So that's going to be near and dear to Dana's heart, I believe. This firm's been involved in it. So with that, Dana, I'll let you take the helm and walk us through your slides. And all right. You are still muted. If you can.
There I am. Oh, now you can hear me, right? Okay.
Yes, I can hear you now. Great.
How's everybody doing? Good? Well, we're gonna change scales, and one of the most important things that I want to say that ties what I'm about to talk about with what Liz just talked about is the solution to our issues of stormwater and flooding. And I will also mention water quality because we don't really think about it very much, but I'll talk about it a little bit, is that what's the answer? What's the answer? The answer is all of the above. It's the multiple choice question that went A, B, C, D, and E was all of the above. That's the answer because we have gone so long, as Liz mentioned, of over 100 years of doing the wrong thing. We didn't know we were doing the wrong thing, but so that has created a whole layering of scales of problems, and then we have to approach the solutions the same way. So I'm going to be a little bit more granular, but I also always back up as a landscape architect and have to look at the big picture and the context. What's important here is to see, and the next slide as well, is to remind us that New Orleans is a coastal community. Sometimes we don't think about it, but we are a coastal community and we're coastally influenced. The other thing to think about here.
I'm not seeing your slides. Did you hit the share screen button down at the bottom?
Do what now?
Are you sharing your screen, the green share screen button at the bottom?
Let me find it.
Of the Zoom.
What about now? Yes? You can see
I am not seeing it.
Okay. Well, I'm glad we worked out all these bugs, huh, Serena? No problem now. So let's see, share screen. It hits share screen, but it doesn't seem to be doing it.
Dana, are you hitting the just the green button itself, the little square?
Yes.
And then does it give you a choice of application or desktop?
No, it doesn't say anything.
Okay. Here, try again. I just changed some settings.
Same thing, unless you can see my screen.
We cannot see your screen. It was working an hour ago.
I know. Does somebody else need to unshare their screen or something? No?
No, I that's the setting I changed, was that which should make it easier for you to share. But if it's not working, you could send me your presentation maybe, and I can share it, but that might take a second. I'm not sure. Is it giving you any option when you hit the green button?
No, it just says Alt S to share.
I mean, I guess maybe try that.
I mean, my problem is my my presentation is pretty big.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be still no, huh?
Still nothing.
Strange, it was working beforehand.
No. Oh, it's working. It seems to be working. All right, we've got your desktop up. So if you open your, yep, good. This is working.
Okay. Well, this is not the most exciting slide anyway, so we'll go right to this one. Thanks to everybody for being patient with that. So the thing to look at here is, in addition to what Liz talked about, that the Mississippi River is draining 41% of the United States, is let's focus on Lake Pontchartrain for a second. And look at everybody who's relying on Lake Pontchartrain to take all of their stormwater. So we're pumping and pumping on the South Shore, but on the North Shore, all of those rivers and bayous are draining into Lake Pontchartrain, and they're doing it at the same time. We're all usually all in a storm. And when it's high tide coming in from the Gulf of Mexico and Lake Borgne, then we really have a problem. So the other theme to think about besides all of the above is, where's the water going to go? Okay, here's a little oblique to really give you the idea of what's going on in relation to the Gulf of Mexico and how close we really are. And we are very, very much affected by it when we're not even talking about hurricanes. We're just talking about rain events because of tides, particularly. And as you saw in one of her slides, or Nathan's slides, see all that whitish gray? I mean, that's basically all impervious surfaces. That's a good way to just think about what that is. And then if you do a little cross section with the Mississippi River on the left and Lake Pontchartrain on the right, you could see the high ground that was built by the Mississippi River on the left, which is where the CBD is and the French Quarter. And then we started building, you could see the Gentilly Ridge where there was building. And then from there to the right toward Lake Pontchartrain was, much of that was just swamp. And we drained it and filled it and thought, well, that's gonna work really well for housing. And so we weren't thinking about, we really weren't thinking about natural processes, which is the third thing to think about, right? Is natural processes. What is really happening? And a lot of times we design things or engineer things at a point in time, and that's all we're looking at is a point in time. And we're not thinking about how dynamic natural processes are and how does what we design and build work within that. So to protect the city, right, we've built all these levees, which when you look at a lot of the maps Liz was showing, the city of New Orleans is pretty well protected for a good while because of the levee system and flood walls. But that's also created a problem of, where does the water go? How do you get the water out? You can even see, everybody talks about part of Broadmoor as being the low spot. You could sort of see it there, right there. And notice all this area along here. This is Kenner way out here. And that's New Orleans East, because I'm going to mention that in a little bit. But you could see in this brownish color, sort of some of the higher ground. It's very subtle, but that's where it is. So here's what we're doing, right? All of the red diamonds are pumping stations. All the sort of bright blue lines are open and what Sturgeon Water Board calls underground channels. I call that a culvert, but you know, sometimes they say it's an underground canal, but there's no such thing. But anyway, and then there's pipes, lots of pipes. This is just the major system that we're looking at. So we've created this other system on top of the system of levees to solve that problem that the levees created, which was to solve the problem of that we've been building in places we probably shouldn't be. And so we keep sort of going down the same path and trying to fix what we did wrong yesterday, or what the impact is of what we did yesterday, shall I say. Okay. So stormwater becomes floodwater, and that again is not anything to do with hurricanes. I mean, hurricanes, there's rain, so it does in that sense. So this is a model. Our team was the local landscape architect for the urban water plan, which now is like 6 years old, hard to believe. But this is one of the models that shows 10-year flooding, and the darker blue means it's over 2 feet deep of water that would occur. So the stormwater becomes floodwater, particularly in a place that's surrounded by levees and flood walls. Now, natural cycles, natural systems, this is back to 8th grade, right? The water cycle. And on the far left is the natural water cycle, where there was condensation in the clouds, and then it rained, and that rain usually went and infiltrated into the ground, or it went deeply into the ground into aquifers, or some of it ran off, not a lot. There was also evaporation, transpiration by trees. Plants took up a lot of the water and used it, but it was evaporated back into the clouds. The thing I want to point out about this is that the water that we see when it rains, or when we're looking at Lake Pontchartrain or Mississippi River, all the water is the only water there will ever be on the earth. Water is not being made somewhere. It's the same water, that's why it's called a water cycle, that just keeps cycling back and forth, all around into different situations. So when we change that natural cycle, we are having a major effect on what's going on with the water, the only water available on the planet. So in the urban water cycle, where there's a lot of impervious surfaces, there's a lot more runoff. You all know that, I'm sure. Less ground infiltration. The runoff makes the water polluted. There's less water for plants, and we don't generally have fewer plants. But there's more runoff, and it changes salinity a lot of times, and we are actually getting salt water into the groundwater. They're even measuring that in like lakeshore area, lakefront area, that the soil is saltier. It's still brackish. It's not salt, but it's still more brackish. Now, if we think of the urban cycle and we add green infrastructure or stormwater management, we're not going to get all the way back to the natural water cycle, but we'll get closer, and we want to get as close as we can, which is why I said all of the above, right? And so if you add vegetation, you take out impervious surfaces so you can have more infiltration, you really can start to get back to the natural cycle of cycling through the only water on the planet. So the big thing about stormwater management, and this is just another little section of the water cycle with green infrastructure, is the words. I'm a big person about words. Words matter. The words we use matter. And so it's stormwater management. It's not stormwater control. Even though every once in a while that word control keeps creeping back into lexicon of hydrology, if we haven't learned yet that we don't control stormwater, then we are really dense. We can manage stormwater. My analogy is, if you have kids or have had kids, I know I didn't control my daughter. I was running her to, was it ballet or tap today, or soccer or basketball practice. I mean, my life was just, managing around what happened with her, or she got sick and you have to leave work, et cetera, et cetera. So your management is what that word says. It's about working with what you have and what happens. So what stormwater management and green infrastructure is doing is using natural systems as much as possible, making sure you protect existing mature trees and retain them that are a really high quality species and they're in good health. Because every time somebody cuts down a tree, well, we'll plant another one. You should say, well, but it's going to be about 40 to 60 years before it gets to the size of the one you just cut down. And so you're not going to have the ecological services that tree provided for another 40 to 60 years. So just be ready to not have those services. I'll talk about those in a minute. You want to minimize impervious surfaces, or depaving is another word, getting rid of the impervious surfaces that are there and replacing them with more pervious land cover. The banks of any kind of drainage channels or canals or rivers or bayous should be maintained in a more natural state, as opposed to the beautiful concrete lined channels that we have, the canals that we have in some parts of New Orleans, and then we put a chain link fence around it because it's dangerous. So that's another thing that really is a theme of all of this, which is a single purpose infrastructure. Single purpose infrastructure is not good, and we'll talk more about that. You want to create room for rainwater to be, and it's best and cheapest to do that as close to where it falls as possible. So all we're doing in stormwater management, if you were to take everything that EPA's website has about green infrastructure, and they'll list many different types, is that they're performing three functions, or one of the three, or two of the three. And this is what is important in the management, is detention. Holding on to the water, detaining the water, like when you got sent to detention after school, you didn't stay there the rest of your life. You were detained a little while. So you're detaining that water for a while. If you just think about the drainage system, if you're detaining the water, you're keeping it from running off and going into the storm drains, right? You're letting those pipes take care of other water. So you're taking some of the burden off of the drainage system. While you're detaining it, if it's green infrastructure, what can happen? It can help the water to infiltrate. So it recharges the groundwater. So it's like a lot of natural processes. They don't happen immediately. It takes a little bit of time. The water has to have time to infiltrate. And when the water is detained and a significant amount of water gets in some kind of detention facility, which could be a rain garden or a bioretention cell or a detention basin, the weight of the water helps to push the water into the ground. And at the same time, if you're detaining the water, filtration can occur, which is where plants and microbes in the soil clean that water before it ever gets into the storm drain. So you've got less water ever going into the storm drain. You have it, what does go in the storm drain is cleaner, and what goes in the storm drain goes in later, so that the burden is taken off the system. The concept to think about is a time of concentration. This is a little wonky, but I don't get too wonky except this time. If you were to take a watershed and look at the point of the watershed that's farthest away from its outlet, right? So Lake Pontchartrain Basin watershed drains into Lake Pontchartrain. The Amite watershed is a sub-watershed of that, for instance, or the Tangipahoa River, or the canal. They all have a place where they outflow into. So this point that's the farthest away from that outflow point, think about that, and it starts to rain, and the water that falls on that drop, that spot that's the farthest away from the outfall, how long does it take that drop of water to get to the outfall? Because if that drop of water is there, all of the other water is already there. This is the very simple version of time of concentration. Slopes and land cover and all come into play, but that's the concept. So if all the other water is there, you've concentrated the water. And so if the time of concentration is short, you flooded people. If it's longer, you give a chance for the system to work better at the outflow point. I hope that makes sense. And so all of these detention, infiltration, filtration are involved. All green infrastructure is about increasing the residence time of water in a spot, hopefully as close to where the rainwater falls as possible, increasing that residence time so that you've extended the time of concentration. It's like a traffic jam. I say everybody gets off at 5:30 and everybody's trying to get on the ramp to get on I-10. If people got off at 4:30 and 4:45 and 5 and 5:15 and 5:30, et cetera, they would be less congestion getting on that ramp. But when we all get off at close to the same time, and I'm exaggerating slightly with traffic, but it's the concept that the cars trying to get on that ramp back up into the surface streets, which is flooding. That's flooding. That's what the water's doing. So green infrastructure mimics natural hydrology, detains the water, uses plants and soils to clean the water. The great thing about it, it's applicable at any scale. It's also can be built and added to and expanded and like that. So it has all these other benefits. It also creates urban habitat. Mississippi Flyway is a major flyway in the world for birds to migrate, but there's also other habitats. It reduces soil subsidence. Part of the problem that we have here is soil subsidence, and a lot of that is because we keep draining water out of the ground. And I mentioned Kenner because Kenner, particularly closer to the lake, still has a capacity for significant soil subsidence and lots of metairie as well. And so if we keep doing what we're doing, the soil is going to subside and we're going to have broken foundations and broken pipes, etc. And if you've heard of the urban heat island effect, I'll talk about that in a second, but it's also a benefit of that. Okay, these are just some green areas. So the urban heat island effect is that in an urban area with a lot of concrete and asphalt and impervious surfaces, the temperatures are higher at the same time of day as it could be just blocks away. Just blocks away that it's cooler. And this is a section sort of through a rural, suburban, and downtown, commercial and downtown areas. So you could see the green space and the plants reduce air temperature. And so that's an actual public health issue here in Louisiana and in New Orleans. And we have a lot of people with respiratory problems, or just a lot of people who are older, and it's very difficult for them to function in the heat. And when you talk about inequity and redlining, when you talk about people in Treme or 7th Ward, there's a large population of older people. There's a large population of people with lower income. They're probably dependent upon transit to get around. Well, they have to walk to transit. And then if we don't have trees there, we don't have shade, they're actually susceptible to heat exhaustion and worse. So there are many types of green infrastructure. I'm not going to go into those per se, but what I want to get into is a neighborhood approach. So a green infrastructure system that is a distributed system, but is integrated, is the way to go. I mentioned landscape architects at the table because too often this is done by engineers, and engineers don't put in plants. They're actually not licensed to even design with plants. But we're licensed and trained to design with plants, design the soils, design even hardscape, all those things. And that's what you needed. And you need the system to be integrated. So you could see this parking lot, the water's running off from the parking lot into this. It's running off of the parking lot here into this big bioswale. These are ones my office designed. That's also pervious concrete under there. This is a big one at City Park. That's a stormwater lot. I'm gonna show you something on in a minute. Okay, ecological services metrics is what's important. So for the urban water plan, which wasn't part of the water plan, but my office wanted to do it because it really sounded like it would tell a story. We had worked in 4 different watershed districts. You can see them listed here. And we figured out land cover and land use typologies based on like 30-acre units, if you will, and the topologies are listed on the right. So it had to do with density and how much pervious and impervious. And those are mapped here on this map. Then we use that to figure out what could we do. Don't do that. Don't do that. There we go. What could we do in these 30-acre areas to improve stormwater management? And we looked at 4 different levels, which could be mix and match. Basic retrofit of areas in the public realm, intense retrofit in the public realm of areas. And I'm going to show you an example with Pontilli in a second. If things were added to private property, and if just basically the tree canopy was significantly increased, what would happen? And we used that, we planned it for each typology, and then we applied that statistically to each of those four catch sub-watersheds that we worked with. And the results in the New Orleans district, we could, with basic intervention, we could take care of 35% of the first inch of water that fell in any rainstorm. If we did, and everything that we proposed was very modest. So if I said I wanted to do street trees, we assumed like 10% of the streets would get street trees. We assumed the bioretention cells would be at 10% of the corners. We were very conservative about it. And I'll show you examples in a second. But if we did everything, including people on private property doing some interventions, we could take care of 70% of the first inch of rain, which is pretty significant, right? And we have it for each of those districts. So let's apply that. These are several projects that are either going on or finished. This is the Gentilly Resilience District. It covers all this, but it covers the Pontilly project. Pontchartrain Park is up here, Gentilly Woods down here, and we're working on that. It's under construction right now. And that started in 2012. So it really wasn't part of the Gentilly Resilience District, but it's in Gentilly, so it sort of counts as it. And that's two neighborhoods with distributed green infrastructure. On the left, it shows you with nothing how much water. And the darkest blue is over 2 feet of water. So this area you could see, and I'll show you a close up in a little while. Don't pay attention to these lagoons in the golf course, but you could see all the areas that flooded. This area had repetitive loss consistently. So even if you're over here and you're not damaging a home or property, people might not be able to get out of their house. So I'm doing a lot of volunteer work that Nathan mentioned with Waterwise Gulf South in Tremay 7th Ward and Upper 9th Ward. And in, I think it's the 7th Ward, there's a woman who is disabled, and every time there's a big storm, she has to get out. The fire department has to come to get her out because she can't get out onto a sidewalk to walk to a bus because everything's so flooded. On the right was our original plan. It got shifted some during subsequent phases, but what you're looking at here are this used to be the right-of-way for Robert E. Lee, so we decided we were going to make that into parks, and we were going to make them into stormwater parks. All these green squares are lots that were vacant that we were allowed to take and turn into stormwater lots. The little circles are, one is at a part of an intersection, so an intersection with 4. Those are curb extensions. Sometimes they're called bulb outs. We call them street basins because, sorry, the name sounds better. And then these little yellow things going across are actually little alleys because you can see this block is really long, so they put in alleys so people could cut across, but nobody uses them. So we looked at those, and then these are long green ones are pervious paving on the lake side of the street in the parking areas. So the parking part of the street where you parallel park on the lake side of the street, we put in pervious paving. We tested many different things, and the engineers modeled it, and we could see what was going to work. And very interestingly, we took these little alleys out of putting in pervious surfaces and making them walkways again. We took those out because they were sort of expensive, but then the whole thing didn't work as well. And we put them back in. We took out these and put those back in. We took out some of these other, so it was a test. The other thing I want to point out is this is a gigantic, see the scale down here? That's from here to here is 200 feet. That's a gigantic bioswale on the south side of the golf course, which, by the way, was designed by, Pontchartrain Park is a historic African-American suburban development after World War II, developed by African-American developer. And the golf course was designed by an African-American golf course architect. And it's all very historic, and there are people who've lived there, and their parents and their grandparents and their grandparents lived there. So lots of roots in these incredibly amazing neighborhoods here. So that's some of the things that were proposed. A few of these lots had to be taken out, but, and then this is the Dwarf Canal. We're regrading some of the Dwarf Canal, which, by the way, none of the water from either of these neighborhoods were designed to drain into. Don't even ask me why. So we designed it so we put lots right next to it, and we are draining into it. So this is under construction right now. So then, of course, we modeled everything we were doing, and here's the before and the after. So we're not taking care of every drop of water, but look at how much we've reduced the over 2 feet of water. It's really in spots now. That's much better. So here's what those curb extensions or street basins look like. And the water rolls down as it normally does, curb and gutter, and we have little gaps in the curb here. We brought the curb out because this is at the corner where you can't park anyway. So this is 20 feet from the corner where you can't park. So we brought the curb out, made that into a bioretention cell, and brought water in here. We blocked up the storm drain, but then we reused it because we have an overflow when it gets really high, and that overflow standpipe takes the water, puts it back in that catch basin. And these are all, we putting in new ADA ramps, and they're connecting pipes at the high point here and here so that these equalize. If more water flows down here and fills this up, before it goes into the overflow, it'll equalize into this area and then equalize into that area. So we've got more green. We've taken out some paving. We've got some more trees, which we put as close as we could without blocking the visible triangle for turning. And you can see how it works in this particular thing. You can see a little cross section of it there. So it's detaining the water. The water has a chance to go down. It's cleaning the water, right? Water's infiltrating into the ground, and it's working the way green infrastructure should work. Here's a rendering of how one of them would work. They're being built right now, so I just thought I'd give you a few of the construction pictures. There's one. You can see that's a good idea of one, and the ramps. That's a stormwater lot where the water comes in. Now the ones we've designed in the past, I'll show you a little video real quick. It comes in from the curb, and we cut a runnel to bring it into the site. On the Pontilli project, we're doing that, but we're also taking water out of the pipe that's in the street because we have the capacity to do that on these stormwater lots. So we're actually taking water out, not only keeping water from going in the pipes, we're taking water out of the pipes and putting them in the stormwater lot so it is detained there for a while, then it has an overflow, then it goes back out. Here's one that's capturing an awful lot of rain. And let's see, here we go. Okay, that one gives you an idea of what happens with a stormwater lot, and that's just taking water off the street, not in the pipe. Here's that bioswale along Prentice on the south side of the golf course. It's huge, and it'll hold 126,000 cubic feet. I don't think in gallons, but cubic feet it's probably more than 500,000 gallons of water. And so here is the site. That's a rendering of what it looked like. And now it's under construction. So they've done the excavation. And I heard this morning they started planting. So you can see how long it is. We avoided the tree canopies of existing trees. That gives you a really good idea of how long it is, with a little walk on the side of it. That's going to take care of a whole lot of water. So that's the Pontilli project. The big thing is that it's distributed. If it's distributed, it can catch the water close to where it falls, as opposed to building a big collection system and conveyance system of pipes to bring it somewhere else to store it until you can pump it out. That's what we're doing right now. It's very costly and not as effective. So this layered on top of that gray infrastructure existing system we have, we've proven can make a huge difference. And that's it.
That's great, Dana. Thank you so much. Yeah, for those who online who don't know, one of the reasons I asked Dana to talk specifically about the Pontilli project is that we at Preservation Resource Center had the privilege to work with the Pontchartrain Park Neighborhood Association and sort of shepherd the process of their applying for recognition on the National Register of Historic Places. And the state committee has endorsed their nomination. It's gone on to the National Park Service and probably would be finalized already if we hadn't had the COVID slowdown. But yeah, great neighborhood. They're very proud of their history. And this is an exciting example of being able to retrofit that at that neighborhood scale in a way that then protects the historic buildings that are there. So I'll remind folks.
Did I need to unshare somehow, or you can take it back?
I'm not sure. Serena, if you can take it back.
Take back the power.
And I'll remind folks, if you want to chat your questions using the chat function, I'll ask Liz and Dana if they would both think about an example of a time when they were interacting with a resident, whether a resident of one of these coastal communities at risk or a resident of an urban neighborhood, where someone's sense of cultural identity or their sense of place, maybe it's a historic building, maybe it's something more general, was really, I think, instrumental in shaping your plans or shaping the outcomes. If you could think of an example, or just in general, some ways people talk about their sense of place and how that influences what they want to see in sort of resilience response.
Well, with Waterwise, I've had that experience a lot. We've also had it with the Community Adaptation Program as part of the Gentilly Resilience District. We're designing, and we have a contractor that works for us. We're building 100 to 150 green infrastructure projects at individual private residences, and each can be worth as much as $25,000 in value. And so that's part of a distributed system to keep the water out of the streets. But so we meet with every one of them and learn a whole lot of great things about their lives and what's important to them. But for instance, in Treme, with Waterwise Gulf South, the big thing is to make sure anything we build that is not just plants or pervious paving, so we build stormwater planters and other things like that, is that we want, and put in rain barrels and such, is that we get a local artist to paint them, and to paint them with the culture, something about the culture of Treme. And we don't want to do this green infrastructure sort of interventions out of context. And so some of those paintings of these big stormwater planter boxes that are made out of concrete are just amazing. First time I saw one of them, my mouth was just dropped to my jaw dropped to the floor. So in that sense, that was what the public asked us to do. And we do all of these projects with the public in Treme and 7th Ward and Upper 9th, and they decide what they want, and they, it's working with them constantly. It's not us telling them what they should do. We teach them, and then they start to decide what to do. But that's been a really great example of how the culture could be integrated.
I'll flag two examples. Well, so we engaged thousands of residents during the LA Safe process, and there were lots of different ways that culture shows up. I would say, just in terms of climate change more broadly, the conversations around communities not being here in the future, or like extreme risk, the reactions to that were generally generational. So like older folks often were like, I'm never leaving, I'm gonna die here, right? But my kids have already left, or they've moved to the next town up, or I want them to have this better life and I don't want them to deal with the risk that I face. You know, and so that time period for us in terms of experiencing climate impacts was really important. The other thing I'll flag that I think is inherently cultural and ties to New Orleans as well as across the coast, it's like, if I had $1 for every person who yelled at me about the need for a levee in their community around Southeast Louisiana, like we probably have enough money to maintain some of our levees, but generally, like, there's such a disconnect between like the culture of, I don't want government spending, and I don't want you know, more taxes, I don't want government regulation, and then also like, where's the line of government people waiting to help me elevate my home or build me a levee or XYZ in my community. And so for me, those two experiences are both like very cultural and very tied to the way we will engage on any of these tough conversations going forward.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's that cycle of disasters that creates a sort of habit of relying on disaster to maintain infrastructure, or to do things that otherwise you'd have to reckon with, finance things differently.
Yeah.
Well, Liz, I know you have someplace you've got to go in just a little bit, so
I have a couple more minutes. I've shifted slightly.
Okay, well, I appreciate you doing that. We have one question that I thought I would put to you, which is, has there been any success in filling channels that were created by oil and gas industry? You know, one source of erosion. Yeah,
so I would say at a small scale, there have been experiments to see if the horizontal hydrology can be reestablished. If you, like, whenever oil and gas channels were dug, the sediment that was dug out was put on the sides. So it not only allowed for saltwater intrusion in the canals, but it stopped any horizontal movement of water across the wetlands. So there have been experiments to, like, if we remove those ridges, can we restore that horizontal hydrology? And those have been effective. But at a large scale, no, there's not a lot. I mean, the damage is decades and generations done in most places. And so there are steps to try to reestablish the dynamic processes of the Delta. And there are whole coalitions of organizations in South Louisiana that just work on pushing, reconnecting the river to the wetlands, and really examining the effectiveness of sediment diversions and reconnecting the river to the estuary. But I don't think it's so far gone in terms of most places with those oil and gas canals. I would also say, when I drive back and forth between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, I'm still seeing the same pipelines that, you know, get constructed and then they subside and then it's open water and it pools. Like, so anyway, I won't get on a soapbox, but.
Well, thank you for tackling that question. Yeah, here's another one. Which, if any, of our neighboring parishes around New Orleans have made commitments to stormwater management or watershed planning? And what are some examples of what's being done outside of New Orleans proper? I think you probably both have some insight on that.
Well, yes. It's much more tentative than here. I'm trying to measure my words. But, you know, for instance, Jefferson Parish has some codes. They tend to be incentivizing as opposed to requiring anything. And a lot of times that is the first baby step you got to take, just to get people used to that, because it's a more developer friendly parish than New Orleans. Not that New Orleans is developer unfriendly. They're more like, if you want to build it here, you got to do it right. And, I mean, I do work in both parishes a lot. So, but I wrote the code for East Baton Rouge Parish years ago. And I mean, no, 16 years ago. And it was adopted by the Planning Commission and the council unanimously, but the people in the Department of Public Works and Permits don't enforce it. And so, yeah, so that's a different thing there. Those are sort of, I get that a lot, where it's like this, a Department of Public Works could get a new director or whatever they call it, and they could understand all of this and say, that's what we need to do. And then on the other end, at the younger people who've been hired over the last few years, they get it. But there's this middle management of engineers who've been there that maybe was their first job out of school, and that's all they've been doing for 30 or 40 years. And they're not going to change how they do things.
Yeah, speed of change is slow. I would just flag that for the LA Safe project portfolio, for those 10 projects in the 6 parishes, there were 4 green infrastructure projects funded. There's one in St. Tammany that is part of the Safe Haven healthcare facility campus. There's Airline and Main project in St. John the Baptist. There's the Gretna Resilience District in Jefferson Parish. And then there is a project in Terrebonne Parish. So there are individual investments going forward in adjacent parishes. So hopefully those help to open up some folks to being more accepting of that type of management. But I also want to flag, in the context of the statewide watershed initiative, the green infrastructure and water management more broadly are needed conversations statewide. And so I do know that there are some allies at different parts of state government trying to incorporate that into how they think about the watershed initiative. And then I'll just flag again that the work of CPEX in designing this watershed game is really a tool to get folks to understand what are the benefits and trade-offs of different types of management of water, whether that's green infrastructure and where gray and green collide, or where you're talking about regional scale investments, or to Dana's point of zooming in to those smaller scale projects and middle scale projects to really affect a broader area.
Yeah, one of the questions we have here is, this is for you, Dana. What was the necessary minimum time span and methodology for data collection for studies, I guess, on green infrastructure interventions? And does it need to come from an official source like EPA or some of the...
Great question. We're doing some data collection ourselves on projects we've done. So we have had 2 of my staff trained by 2 different people who are experts in the industry about doing our water quality and groundwater recharge testing and monitoring. But the time span thing is a very important question. And the reason is that you put, plants grow, plants grow. So you put in a green infrastructure and you plant plants, and at that moment, that bioretention cell, whatever it may be, bioswale, is not as effective as it's going to be in a few years. And part of that is what bothers me about, we do infiltration tests at a point in time on the native soil that's there. And then a lot of times you'll get back from the geotechnical engineer, well, there's no infiltration, so it's not going to work. You're not going to infiltrate anything. And I know that when you plant native plants, their roots are very deep in those clay soils. So they will actually pipe into the clay soils and create paths for water and air to go. They actually are fundamentally changing the characteristics of that soil. So if you're going to test it, you've got to go through, I say, 3 growing seasons. So you plant it in the spring, and then you got to go through, test it all along the way. How's it doing in the fall, and then back in the next spring? And so you're giving the plants a chance to get established, but then to start, providing all the benefits that they can provide. And then you know. And then that's another reason why native plants are so important. Their roots are deeper. They're used to being here. You can't plant non-natives and expect, plus I'll come find you if you do. I will come find you and we'll have a chat. It's not good for wildlife or anything.
We also had a question about drought, about the fact that we have floods, and that's our main water problem, but occasionally we have drought. So I think, the short answer to that probably is also working with native plants.
Exactly. They're used to that.
Great. Well, I want to be respectful of everyone's time, and I know we've gone to almost an hour and a half now. I appreciate everyone hanging in there, especially with the kind of technical hiccups. But I'm going to let you each answer the last question, which is, what is the one thing you would recommend for an individual, a person who is watching, has learned a lot? What can they do as a takeaway action step?
I'll jump in. I would say talk to your family and friends about this stuff, because it's often really technical information, and lots of people love to be wonky and nerd out about it, themselves. But how do we make this accessible to people who are not as familiar with the information? So really connecting your own personal experience with these issues, changes, opportunities, and bringing other folks into the dialogue, even if it's just, around a barbecue or at your family member's house.
Great.
That's a great answer. Be evangelical, right, about it. I think that's a great answer, and do whatever you can do on your property, and start to show that as an example. I would encourage starting in the front yard, because people see that, and if you need help or guidance, waterwisegulfsouth.org has a lot of information, and there are other sites for what to do here in New Orleans area. But if you could start doing things and implementing things, and talking to people about it, but now you got something to show them. We've put in with Waterwise Gulf South, we do it all with volunteers, such as a bioswale along the side of somebody's house, because a house was built next to them on fill, and it's now higher, draining right across their driveway and underneath their raised house. And we put this bioswale along the side there in these narrow little spaces that we all have, and they don't have the problem anymore. And so they can testify. If I'm going to continue the evangelical theme, they can testify to the fact that it works, and then people see it and ask them questions, and so that will help make you an advocate as well.
Excellent. All right. Well, I'm going to share just a few more resources slides here, if my screen cooperates, and I'll ask that.
I'm going to jump off, guys. I just want to say thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Dana. I'll ask that. Maybe it's not going to work. Y'all send us your PowerPoints, and then we'll package that and make that available to everyone who participated today, if they're interested in seeing that. And let everybody know we do have a class on Wednesday about moisture management in your house, which is related topic, obviously, to water management at the neighborhood scale or at the urban scale. And we also, on Wednesday evening, have a special book talk with Richard Campanella, his new book about the West Bank. And so speaking of the Gretna Resilience District, there we go. Okay. I don't know why it took so long to do that, but here's a couple slides that I'll put into the package. Doreen will help me put into the package for all the participants. Additional further reading, and there's really a whole lot out there. This is not by any means an attempt to be comprehensive, but report by ICOMOS on cultural heritage and climate action, a couple of great series from the Lens and ProPublica about Southeast Louisiana, resources from the Park Service, Greater New Orleans Urban Water Plan, and the city's resilience strategy. And then these are articles from our magazine, Preservation in Print, some of which I referred to earlier, that look at issues intersecting with the environment, climate change, water management, sustainability, and our historic resources. Obviously, we want to keep water out of historic houses, so we've got to get it someplace to be. So we're very interested in these projects, and hopefully we'll be able to do some future webinars or maybe in-person classes looking at exactly what you can do as a homeowner or a property owner, and drill down further into the interventions that Dana was describing. So with that, I'll close with a big thank you to our presenters and to everyone who has hung on the line to learn with us today. I hope that if you're not already a member, you'll join Preservation Resource Center, buy a t-shirt, buy a book, follow us on social media, whatever fits your budget, but definitely stay connected, and we'll keep learning together. Hang in there, everybody.
Thanks, Nathan.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nathan. Bye, everyone.